Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. Are you okay? I'm just asking, are you okay? Even though you're probably doing just fine, where does the term okay even come from? And was Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, just okay? Or was he one of the most important political figures of his time? Let's do this. Martin Van Buren was born on December 5th, 1782, in Kinderhook, New York. And he holds a unique distinction as the first president of the United States who was born an American citizen. Meaning he hadn't been a British subject at some point in his life. That set him apart from the Revolutionary War generation that came before him. He also grew up in a household that spoke Dutch, making him the only president whose first language was not English. And this small-town upbringing in Kinderhook, New York, shaped his identity early on. Because of his hometown, he gained the nickname Old Kinderhook, a label that would not only follow him into national politics, but connect him to one of the most recognizable words in the world. But we'll get to that later. Martin Van Buren trained as a lawyer under a local attorney in Kinderhook, and he entered politics early when he became a New York State Senator in 1803. Right when he joined politics, he showed a natural ability to build relationships and organize support. He later served as a United States Senator from New York from 1821 to 1828. And during this period, American politics, they reached a breaking point with the election of 1824. I actually made an episode in Season 2 about corruption and rivalry, the elections of 1824 and 1828. And here's a very shortened version. There were 4 candidates running in the election of 1824. Were they running for different parties? No, they all ran as Democratic Republicans. And the 2 frontrunners, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, were pretty close. Andrew Jackson had 99 electoral votes, while John Quincy Adams was stuck in the 80s. So what's the problem? Andrew Jackson didn't have a majority, so they sent this to the House of Representatives. Who was the Speaker of the House at the time? Henry Clay. Henry Clay was buddy-buddy with John Quincy Adams, and we know how it went. Not only did Henry Clay influence the entire House to vote in John Quincy Adams's favor, but in the end, Henry Clay became John Quincy Adams' Secretary of State. Coincidence? Absolutely not. Yeah, this system was not doing too hot. When one centralized party elects 4 candidates for the presidency, it gets to a point where it doesn't work smoothly. So Andrew Jackson had a plan. A revenge plan. Seeing this confusion for multiple candidates in one party, Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson, who were close political allies at the time, worked together to create a more organized political structure. We don't want 4 candidates for the same party. We want to form a new party. So Van Buren and Jackson helped form the Democratic Party. And really, they laid the foundation for the two-party system that we know today, where each party would nominate one candidate and present voters with two options. So instead of having to pick from Billy, Jimmy, Greg, or Bob, all you gotta do is pick between Billy and Jimmy. One major candidate from each party. It just made sense, and it allowed the parties to work together to raise up their candidate, and not just say, psh, whatever, I don't care, you can run for president, good luck, pat on the back. While that system had worked okay up until this point in American history, it needed to be clarified and changed. And in the end, the two-party system, and if you read about Martin Van Buren, he's often called the father of the two-party system, because later we're going to figure out that Martin Van Buren is an extremely skilled politician. He knows what he's talking about. And Martin Van Buren's ideas when it came to the two-party system have surely stood the test of time. In 1828, Andrew Jackson came back guns a-blazing and won the presidency. And he asked Martin Van Buren, who had only been the governor of New York for 3 months, to be his Secretary of State. And as we know through American history, the Secretary of State, especially at this time, is a great stepping stone to the presidency. And there's only one other position that would really be closer to the presidency, right? The vice presidency. Well, it's okay. Andrew Jackson chose John C. Calhoun as his vice president. It's okay, Van Buren. You'll get your time in the spotlight. Especially when John C. Calhoun makes the terrible decision to mess with Andrew Jackson. During Jackson's first term, there was a little event called the nullification crisis, where, to put it simply, the big federal government was asking South Carolina to pay its bills. They owed money for tariffs, but South Carolina said, nuh-uh. And it caused a tussle between states' rights versus federal rights. John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson fully disagreed with each other on this issue. And Andrew Jackson, being the fiery fella he was, said, yeah, I'm not re-electing you as my vice president. And it went just like this. When Andrew Jackson was back on the ticket in 1832, he didn't have Calhoun as his VP. He decided to put Martin Van Buren on the ticket. Yes, come on, Van Buren. I believe in you, dude. And as we remember, Van Buren and Jackson were great friends. They worked well together. They're going to do great when they run for president. So they did. Martin Van Buren served as vice president from 1833 to 1837, placing him directly in line to succeed Andrew Jackson. In the election of 1836, Andrew Jackson had said, my time is over, you should elect Martin Van Buren. And Andrew Jackson was the popular guy on the street. So if Andrew Jackson tells me to vote for somebody, my goodness, I'm gonna vote for that person. And after Andrew Jackson's grand support, it worked. Martin Van Buren had become the 8th president of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". Franklin Delano Roosevelt served as president for more than 4,000 days. Those are facts. But here's another fact. The fact that Presidents Unplugged has an Instagram page. If you want updates on the show and announcements about what's coming next, follow us at Presidents_Unplugged. That is Presidents_Unplugged. I'll see you there. Martin Van Buren became president during an extremely difficult moment in American history. Andrew Jackson had just been basically fighting with the banks for the last 8 years. So Andrew Jackson left a not-so-desirable economy to Martin Van Buren, which caused the Panic of 1837. A severe economic depression that led to bank failures, unemployment, and falling prices. And even though we really want our gas prices to fall right now, at this time, falling prices meant that nobody was really making any money, and the value of things was going down lower and lower and lower. This economic crisis would burden Van Buren for pretty much his entire presidency. And, today we think, okay, the economy's not doing too hot, the government's going to step in. It's what they did during the Great Depression. But no. Martin Van Buren, who created the Democratic Party, believed in limited government. That's just a proof to you how parties change over time. I mean, the Democratic Party believing in limited government. And Martin Van Buren, instead of saying, okay, this is what we're gonna do to make the dollar worth more. No. Instead of Van Buren intervening with the public when it came to the economy, he dealt with the United States government's issues, like separating government funds into different private banks. He realized that that would probably help the economy more than dealing with the people's individual problems. But the Panic of 1837 was a really bad time in American history. The effects of the Depression wouldn't really be gone until the early 1840s. This burdened Van Buren not for 1 or 2 years, but his entire presidency. And how was Martin Van Buren different from Andrew Jackson? I mean, they were from the same party. They should have the same values and the same gifts. No, they were completely different. Van Buren lacked the charisma that Andrew Jackson had to really convince people, and he was often criticized for being too formal and too reserved for the American people. But Martin Van Buren, even though he was a lot quieter, he had some of the most political skill of any United States president, earning the nickname the Little Magician for his ability to build connections and maneuver through complex political situations, even if he was only 5'6". And during the Van Buren presidency, he also opposed the annexation of Texas, recognizing something that John Tyler didn't. He thought, Texas is really big. If Texas joins the United States as a slave state, it could potentially be divided into multiple states, and that could give the Confederacy a bunch of power in Congress. The annexation of Texas, although it could give us a new state, or at that time they thought it could have been 2, 3, 4, even 5 states, it would be risky because it would throw off the balance that had been created through all of these compromises over the last 15 years when it came to slavery. There were lots of issues going on during Van Buren's presidency. His time in office revealed to us how difficult it is following an extremely popular leader like Andrew Jackson. He learned that being president required serving the entire nation rather than just simply advancing the goals of one party. When you become president, even if you were elected as a, let's just say, Democrat, you shouldn't only try to benefit the Democratic Party when you're president. If you're elected as a Republican, you should not only try to benefit the Republican Party. You're not just fighting for your party, you're fighting for the American good. And that was a lesson that Martin Van Buren had to learn himself. And then comes Martin Van Buren's re-election bid in 1840, where he was put against the Tippecanoe and Tyler II campaign. One of the strongest and one of the first ever campaign slogans in American history. But I gotta give credit where credit is due. Martin Van Buren ran a pretty good campaign. It just wasn't too successful. Martin Van Buren, remember how he was called Old Kinderhook? Well, that was eventually shortened down to OK. And then, happening all around the same time, there was a joke going around in the 1800s where people would just misspell common phrases and then kind of use them as code words. One of those phrases was all correct, which was misspelled as all correct, starting with an O and a K instead of an A and a C. That OK eventually got put together into the common phrase of agreement that we use today. So these two things happening at once gave us the OK campaign, where we were trying to say that Martin Van Buren was okay. He was all correct. Even though it didn't go so well, the OK campaign and Martin Van Buren's nickname are actually the reason that we use the words so commonly today. And now the term okay is the most recognizable phrase in the entire world. Later down the line, Van Buren ran again in 1848. So he ran for the Democratic Party, right? I mean, it's the party he created. I mean, he wouldn't have ran as a Whig. I mean, that was the other party at the time. He's the father of the two-party system. It only makes sense he would... He ran as a third party? How does that even make sense? Van Buren believed in the two-party system, yet in 1848 he ran in the Free Soil Party, opposing the expansion of slavery. There it is, ladies and gentlemen. Martin Van Buren, the legitimate creator of the two-party political system, ran a candidacy against the Democratic Party. And to be fair, the Whig Party as well, because he opposed the expansion of slavery. Why was Martin Van Buren leaving the party that he worked with Andrew Jackson to create? He believed that the party that he had just made was already moving in the wrong direction. And although he lost the 1848 election to Zachary Taylor, who was an extremely popular military general at the time, his campaign made a powerful statement about party loyalty. How you shouldn't just stick to a party because you have your whole life. If you don't agree with them, you should be able to make your own decisions and run third-party candidacies for president. And Martin Van Buren disagreed with the Democratic Party at the time because they were beginning to value pro-slavery voices within the Democratic Party because it was more located in the South. And Van Buren just solely did not agree with that. 14 years after running this anti-slavery campaign with the Free Soil Party, at the age of 79, Martin Van Buren passed away in Kinderhook, New York, where his journey started. Van Buren's greatest legacy is shaping the structure of American party politics today. Even though obviously I joked about Van Buren creating the two-party system and him running a third-party candidacy, it's important to realize that we might not have the two-party system in American politics today without Martin Van Buren. And his story shows us that leadership is not always about the charisma, but it's about the connections and the commitments that you can make to your country. He was a thoughtful politician navigating an extremely complex era of American history. And to answer the question from the beginning of the episode, is Martin Van Buren just okay? Absolutely not. Martin Van Buren was an exceptional politician who shaped not only his own era, but the very structure of American politics. His ideas, especially when talking about our political system, still influence how leaders campaign, how parties organize, and how Americans choose their presidents. His impact on our country will never be forgotten. And that is why Martin Van Buren is so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about Donald J. Trump's first term. All the way back in Season 1, we discussed Against All Odds, the making of Donald Trump. How did he even get to this point? But now we're discussing the presidency. When he was elected in 2016, how did that go? And when he became the president, what did he do for the American people? And how will his ideas, some that we're feeling in his current second presidency, affect us not only today, but for many generations to come? Learn about that and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. Thank you for listening to Presidents Unplugged. If you enjoy content like this, give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, when do we release new content? Once a month, maybe twice a year, maybe even once a year? No. We release new content every Friday at 1 p.m. for my American enthusiasts to enjoy. Come join me on our dive into making American history the most entertaining and interesting subject to learn every single week. I'm Ty Svensson, this is Presidents Unplugged, and I'll see you soon.